I want to introduce Professor Megan May. So Megan, I just have to tell a quick story. She's one of don't tell her this, I don't want it to go to her head, but she's one of my favorite faculty here at UNE. I first met her at a conference in Philadelphia at the Osteopathic Medical Association conference, and I was down there and I saw on the schedule that a UNE faculty member was going to speak. And so I said, I think I'll go to that. And I sat down, and the poor thing recognized me, and she's like, oh great, I have to give a talk in front of the president here. But she gave this amazing talk about a serendipitous hallway conversation that led to a major discovery in her lab having to do with the functioning of the Zika virus. And I was so impressed by that. But what I was most impressed by, other than the content of the science, was her ability to tell the story. She told the story in such an engaging, down-to-earth way. And not a lot of scientists can do that, right? Can actually translate and tell the story in a way that is so appealing and that you can really relate to it. And what I've since learned about Megan is that she really believes in the importance of science education, not just in the classroom, but helping the public understand the importance of scientific developments and a scientific mindset, a way of thinking scientifically. And this is actually something that resonates with me personally, because I also did a lot of that earlier in my career and felt very passionately about that and spent time doing science education kind of work. And so without further ado, I really have to tell you, it's going to be a delight hearing from Megan. So please, Megan.
Can take that, now that I've droned on a bit, now I'll let her drone on for a while. I'm going to take it as a fun build-up. In any event, when I was first asked to give this presentation, which, as I understand, is a new feature of the President's Gala / President's yearly event, UNE Experience, I was originally planning to do what I usually do, which is talk about some wonky, crazy disease and have everybody get a little bit grossed out, but mostly calm down and that it's all fine and we're not all going to die. But it occurred to me that since this is for the UNE community, I should tell a UNE story. And then it occurred to me that we have an incredible number of very, very cool stories to tell. And we don't always tell them loudly enough, or broadly enough, or to anyone other than ourselves and our colleagues in the hallway. And I started thinking, how should we do that better? So I had this thought, I started going down a rabbit hole with it, and I got very excited about it, and then I thought, I don't know if this is what anyone had in mind. So I promptly wrote James an email and said, I imagine you probably wanted a sciencey talk, but what do you think of this idea? And he called my cell phone about 45 seconds later and said, this would be great, this would be so much fun. And we had a nice long talk about it and what kind of features would be cool. So, that being said, I'm going to talk to you about how we can tell stories in sound bites. The first question I have for you, if my slide changes. Maybe. We'll see. There it is. Okay. The first question that I had for you is to think about a major science story that was happening in the summer of autumn of 2014. Does anyone remember what it was? Not Zika virus. What about now? Remember now? Ebola virus outbreak. So, if I could give an impression of your faces when I said that, a few people kind of frowned and were trying to think, and a few people were like, would you just get on with it, please? And a couple people said Zika, and one person said Ebola, which is great. But when I showed this picture, instantly everybody remembered exactly what was happening. And the reason, I think, when I reflected on it, was that we didn't think of this as a science story or even a health story. We thought of this as a threatening story. If you think back to the news coverage when this was going on, the tone of it was always very agitated and hyper and just urgent. And I don't mean to make light of it. It was a very urgent situation, but we were talking about tens of thousands of people, which is a lot, but on a global scale is not very many, in a relatively contained part of the world that was thousands of miles away from where we all were talking about it. And yet, this was more or less the communication that we were getting. There was a lot of activity from the Islamic State at the same time, so naturally we talked about them in the same sentence, right? Because they had a lot in common. It's vowels, I guess, but other than that, they really didn't. There was a lot of, is Ebola the ISIS of biological agents, and which of these things are you more scared of? Or are you scared of them equally? And we didn't have a lot from the expert community coming out, other than the head of the CDC and the head of the NIAID coming out and saying, you don't need to worry about this, just stop talking about it. If this is the message you're getting, and you just have these two kind of grumpy gentlemen saying, don't worry about that, don't be stupid, that doesn't really sit well. People were scared, and they weren't addressing that fear. So then we started having these types of conversations, where people started saying, well, should we block people from those countries? We shouldn't let them here? And it wasn't just us in the US that were talking about that. They were talking about it in the UK too. They were talking about it in Australia as well. They were talking about it in Japan too. So it wasn't just us. It was a global problem that people were having this conversation about banning people, but nobody was really talking about the actual risk associated with that. What we needed before these conversations started was an expert who had the trust of the public coming out and saying exactly what the good folks at knowyourmemes.com said, which was this. We needed somebody to simply, incredibly say, are you concerned about Ebola? No. Good. That's good. Yes. Okay. Follow-up question. Have you had direct contact with the bodily fluids of an infected person? Yes. Please consult the proper authorities. No. Not so polite term for settle down, because it's going to be fine. This is how you become infected. Direct contact with bodily fluid is how you become infected. If you have not had that, you do not need to panic. I understand it's scary, but those are the parameters we're working with. But we didn't have that. And we didn't start having that until this situation of communication had really spiraled out of control. And then this happened. For the first time, we had Ebola patients in the United States in 2014. And the first two, one of whom was a woman named Nancy Reipel, and the other of whom was a physician named Kent Brantley. They both worked for a charity called Samaritan's Purse, where they had gone over. They were trying to help patients. They were US citizens, and they were brought home for treatment. One thing that we learned about Ebola in this outbreak was that it is actually far more treatable than we all realized it was. If you do appropriate fever control and you keep ahead of a person's fluid loss, they have a good chance of survival, but you need good Western medicine to do that. If they had stayed in Sierra Leone, neither of them would have survived, okay? So when we think about the idea of we can't have those people here, you're giving them a death sentence, and we really ought to take that very seriously. As you can see, both of these individuals were transported in full hazmat suits, as were their caretakers. They were medevaced to the United States, and they were taken immediately into containment hospitals. So there really was not risk of exposure here. This was done in a very safe way. However, the way that it was discussed publicly, you would think that these two were chucked on a JetBlue flight and left to just ooze all over the people next to them. That obviously wasn't the case. That didn't happen, and everyone was fine. But that's not how we discussed it. How we discussed it was as follows. Sorry, it turns out memes have a lot of swear words in them, so I apologize. What happened was you saw all kinds of pictures like this. people having sat through all this coverage about Ebola being equivalent to ISIS and it's going to kill us all, and then we learn we're bringing patients back here to the US. Never mind they would have died if they'd stayed there. Never mind they were US citizens who can repatriate any darn time they'd please. We were talking like this. This was bothering me, but I really jumped off the fence in terms of science communication when this happened. So this was a social media post from a US politician, and I saw it in its original form, but I also saw it on my own social media feeds, passed around and retweeted and shared dozens and dozens of times by people that I've known since I was a small child, people I thought I knew quite well. And this is what it said. It said, the US cannot allow Ebola-infected people back. People that go far away places to help out are great, but they must suffer the consequences. Ooh, suffer the consequences. And I thought of that in two ways. First is a person who has worked overseas in developed countries. I've worked in Africa. I didn't work in West Africa, but I worked in Africa. What if that had been me? These people I've known for 20 years suddenly would have been perfectly okay to let me stay there and die, let my kids grow up without a mom, all because of some misinformation and some failures to communicate. And that wasn't okay with me anymore, because I thought, I have something to say about this, and I think I can say it in a way that might be relatable. So I'm going to start doing that. It begs the question, what exactly is the role of the academy? What's the purpose of universities in society? Right? So we all feel pretty comfortable with this. We teach and train students. We all know that. Most people in society realize we also conduct research and scholarship. But there's this third piece over here, this kind of vague, squishy idea of service. So that can mean service to our own institution, service to our own profession, service to our community, service to the world, service to humanity. But what exactly does that mean? What is service? And to me, service from academics suddenly encompasses this idea of sharing what it is that we know with anybody who would like to hear it. So I was struck by this quote from the New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, and it is, some of the smartest thinkers on problems at home and around the world are university professors, but most of them just don't matter in today's great debates. That, ouch, right? That hurts to hear a little bit, but I'm not convinced it's untrue. Why is that? We're incredibly trained people. Why aren't we part of these conversations? And how do we become part of these conversations? So that brings to the question, academics and outreach. Before we get into this, I want to say something quickly about the idea of data. And I'm going to give you a piece of data to chew on. And that piece of data is 5. Does that mean anything to you? No, it's 5. 5 what? Who collected it? Is it an average of 5, or is it one thing? What is this? What are we talking about here? What about 5 fingers? It's a little better. 5 fingers on Megan May's right hand. All right, now we know what we're talking about. That's great. However, academics have a terrible tendency to do some of the following, which might be, if my animation would work. There we go. 5 phalanges attached to metacarpals by the proximal and distal intraphalangeal joints, which are then attached to carpals, which are then attached to the radius and the ulna of one Megan Ann May. And her radius has a slight curved angle due to a fracture that occurred at the age of 6 in an improper setting due to the overwhelming use of plaster casts in 1985. Okay, we're still talking about Megan's fingers, but all of that was probably not necessary. And sometimes it's a little alienating. Okay, but it's not just scientists that do that, if I may say. What about this? 5 fingers on Megan May's hand that are at a distinctly different angle than the famous lithograph drawing hands as produced by the Dutch artist M.C. Escher in 1948. Again, we're still talking about Megan's fingers, but we didn't need the rest of that, per se. It's great if we want to talk about it, but we didn't need to talk about it. And it's not just that either. What about 5 fingers on the hand of Megan May when she raised it on June 14th, 2018 in Innovation Hall, formerly known as the Stevens Avenue Armory in Portland, until it was purchased by the University of New England, established in 1978 in 2014. We don't need all that. We're still talking about Megan's fingers. And the reason why that matters is that there are people who are going to shout 5 at you. And they're going to shout, I have data, and the data are 5, and how could you argue with 5? 5 is data. And if the other person talking is going on about phalanges and carpals and radius and ulna and all that jazz, we can have people yelling and screaming 5 and using 5 to build a narrative that's not real. But if the person who's speaking in reality is speaking in a way that we can't relate to and is overwhelming us with information, then the person making the false narrative wins the argument. It doesn't matter if they're right or wrong, they win the argument. So that's a problem. I think it's a fixable problem, but it is a problem. Compounding that is that we as academics have historically not been super awesome about outreach. And I think there's no better example of that than this gentleman right here. So this is a mechanical engineer by the name of Bill Nye, AKA Bill Nye the Science Guy. So he's had numerous television shows, written numerous books, beloved by the masses, inspired many children to go into science, be interested in science, not be afraid of it, abhorred by scientists. He's not a real scientist. He's an engineer. He's not really one of us. We are not particularly nice to Bill Nye, even though he's done a lot more for outreach than most of us have. So we have a terrible tendency to A, not be particularly skilled at outreach, and B, eschew it and scoff at it and make fun of those who do it. That's not helpful. That is not remotely helpful. So how do we push back on this? How do we deal with this? We're not combating current narratives. Things like experts don't matter. Things like everybody who wants to tell you something about science is a paid industry shill. I would drive a much better car, by the way, if I were a paid industry shill. There's also this narrative that every viewpoint is equally valid, and that's not true either. But here it is. The other issue that we have is that we're combating things like this. So we have a comic up here. It's meant to be a CDC person of some sort. And you have these foolish guys who are knocking over the Ebola, which is apparently pink, and this poison juice over here, and we have to remind ourselves that we disinfected, then we take off our hazmat suits. But trust us, we've got this all under control. And then there's this nerdy, creepy guy up here. I don't know what his fingers are doing here and not in the hands, but that's fine. I'm not sure if this is intentional, but he kind of looks like the villain from the Captain Underpants books. The point here being that this comic found an audience. And you might be tempted to say, well, calm down, nerd, okay? Because everybody gets made fun of in the various far reaches of the internet. But here's the thing. This was in the Chicago Tribune. And the reason why such a comic would be published in the Chicago Tribune is that comedy tells truth. People knew that people reading the Chicago Tribune would see that and get the joke, right? You can't trust them. They don't really know what they're doing. Of course they do. Were people infected that were brought into containment hospitals? No. Are people working with live BSL 2, 3, 4 Asians every day in this country on our campuses and not infecting people? Of course we are. You know what we're doing. But somehow we have this impression in the masses. So how do we fix that? How do we push back on that? And I think a great way to start is we learn how to talk to people. Another great way to start is we push back on that idea of every side needing an equal say when evidence does not support equal says. I have my own facetious idea about this, right? So we all know the cable news split screen move, right? Where you have two opposing viewpoint experts and you just like wind them up and let them yell at each other for 5 minutes and then nobody's learned anything or changed any minds. And the topic here I blacked out, but it doesn't matter what the topic is. It's the same format regardless. So my thought facetiously was like, all right, so what if you had a topic? What if you proportionally made the image of the person on the screen, right? So if you're talking about human-derived climate change, you know, and this lady is arguing for that, and this dude is arguing against that, she occupies 97% of the screen, and he occupies 3% of the screen. You know, give like a subtle way of saying these two positions are not equivalent. Maybe not, but that's my idea. I don't think you could get anyone to go for that. What we need to do is first get better at telling stories. As we've discussed several times, speaking in sound bites. The problem with that is that is diametrically opposed to everything PhDs are ever taught in their training, right? We're taught, write a 300-page thesis. The heavier your CV is, the more accomplished you are. And if you can't draw 5 historical parallels to every current event going on, then I just have no use for you. It's diametrically opposed to what we're taught. But the good news is we were taught that, so we can unlearn that. Or we can learn a completely different skill set that's complementary to that, which is how do you distill your point down quickly to one thing that you'd like to communicate? What if we created training programs to do that? And what if we incentivized UNE faculty to do that? What if we made it so that it wasn't something to roll your eyes at, but something that we celebrate and that we're proud of and that we encourage people to do? And it's not just things like, how do you talk into a camera? You don't look at it. I learned that one. Also, you don't wear green if you're in front of a green screen or the internet's going to have fun with you. Those are important, but they're not the most important things. The most important things are to look at the question you're being asked, figure out what is the most important take-home thing that you want people to get out of your communication, and you need to meet people where they are. I'm going to tell you a quick story about an interview I gave 5 or 6 weeks ago. I got an email from a reporter, and he said, may I ask you a couple of questions about, I swear this is true, homeopathic treatments for rabies. How I wish I were making that up, but I am not. So I'm very glad that this gentleman wrote me an email instead of calling me, because I had a little bit of time to have a knee-jerk, wait, what moment, and then think about, all right, how would I like to address this? Rabies is a almost uniformly fatal disease. It is nothing to trifle with. We have a very effective post-exposure method of treating people. If it's taken, people survive. If it is not taken, people die. This is very straightforward. So I thought, that is what I would like to get across to people, that we don't want to mess with rabies. That's not a thing that we should worry about. But in order to communicate that effectively, through the lens of someone asking about homeopathic treatments, I thought, I have to know what that treatment is. And I don't know what that treatment is, so I have to look it up. I have to educate myself on it. And even if I don't agree with it, I have to know what are the parameters of this discussion. So I went, I looked it up, I learned what a nosode is, And I was ready to have an interview about this topic right here, which is a story about a Canadian homeopathic physician who used saliva from a dog with rabies to treat a boy who was having behavioral problems. Now, my first thought upon reading what a nosode was, which is some teeny part of a problematic substance that you give to cure the problematic substance, was there's no way that this actually happened. Where does one procure rabid dog saliva? If you think about it, do you go to the rabid dog shelter? Not the healthy dog shelter, but the rabid dog shelter. They're kept for just these occasions. You go get them to drool in a cup and you dodge while they're biting at you. No, that obviously didn't happen. So I don't know what this child was administered, but I'm guessing it was not actually rabid dog saliva. The point here, though, is we don't sarcastically say that to people, except you find people right now, because I kind of thought it was funny. But the point here is that we get across to people, that is not safe. Here's what's safe. Here's the long and short of it. If you do not take appropriate treatment, you will die of rabies. Do not mess with that. That's all we need to say. We don't need to make fun of anybody. We don't need to question their choices. We just need to get that across. All right. So another point to consider is branding. What if at UNE we became known as the people who can talk to people? Kind of unusual in higher ed. As I am summarily reminded by my various bosses on numerous occasions, budgets are not unlimited, and that goes for advertising budgets as well. What if we become the people who can talk to people, and therefore we're advertising without really advertising? It looks great for us. What if we made a strategic investment in communications and outreach? What if we made it a priority to work with our faculty to get better and better at this? We already have some faculty who are really wonderful at this. Here are some of them now. I don't know if any of you are here because I can't really see, but if you are all fabulous at this. What if we do this so often and so well that we regain some of that trust? We become trusted, we become landmark. And then we have rebranded. That might need some work. I don't know, branding's not really my thing. But talking is my thing. I'm going to finish by bringing this full circle. As some of you may or may not know, we're currently having an Ebola outbreak in 2018 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's 60 cases, 30 people have died. It's been on the news, but it's not been wall to wall the way it was in 2014. One piece I want to point out is that there was one case, which then became 4 cases, in a city called Mbandaka. This matters, and I bring it up, because that city is a major port, and it has 1.2 million people living in it. Now, if you remember, one case of Ebola in a big city with over 1 million people in it is when all the hysteria started in 2014. Yet, it's been pretty calm. It's serious, we're managing it, we're handling it, we are talking about it, but nobody's panicking about it. And I think that has a lot to do with how hard a lot of us worked at talking about this and making it clear what the risks were and what was hysteria, what we needed to worry about and what we needed to do and what we didn't need to worry about. So, if you've not heard the panic, I haven't either. Outreach works, and I would really love it if we became the people who are known to talk to people well. Thank you.